Ever heard of a doctor prescribing arsenic as medicine? Or people sipping coke-laced wine just to relax after work? The Victorians weren't teeing just into tea and stiff collars. They were also hooked on some of the strangest drugs you can imagine. And trust me, by the time we hit number 7, you want to believe what people used to put in their bodies. This is boring history, but the fun kind. Today, we're rediving into the weird world of Victorian medicine. We'd re-talking about 7 strange drugs people swore by, the ones they trusted for everything from toothaches to nervous exhaustion. The Victorians thought they were curing themselves. But what they were really doing was slowly poisoning their own lives in ways they didn't even understand. Stick around, because the last one on our list, it's probably the most unbelievable of them all. The Victorian era is remembered for its progress. Steam trains raced across the countryside, factories roared in every major city. Telegrams could send messages faster than anyone thought possible, and new inventions seemed to arrive every year. On the surface, it was a golden age of innovation. But underneath all of that shiny progress, people were quietly suffering from one huge problem. Medicine had not caught up. Imagine living in London in the mid-1800s. The city is crowded, smoky, and dirty. Horse manure piles up on the streets, coal smoke chokes the air, drinking water is often contaminated with sewage. And then add on top of that a medical system that's closer to guesswork than science. If you got sick, there was no guarantee that your doctor actually understood what was happening to you. At this time, germ theory, the idea that tiny, invisible organisms cause disease, was still brand new. Many doctors didn't believe it. Some still thought diseases came from bad air, called miasma. That's right, if you caught cholera, they assumed it was because you breathed in foul smells, not because bacteria in the water was poisoning you. So when people got sick, doctors often couldn't explain why. They just prescribed what seemed to make sense at the time. This is the heart of the problem. Medicine in the Victorian era wasn't really about curing disease. It was about controlling symptoms, numbing pain, calming nerves, and helping people get through daily life. And the drugs that people swore by often did just that, at least in the short term. Arsenic made you feel more energetic. Cocaine boosted your mood. Opium dulled your pain. Mercury seemed to flush sickness out of your body. But underneath those quick fixes, the drugs were doing real damage. Addiction spread like wildfire. People's bodies broke down from constant exposure to toxic chemicals. And because everyone trusted doctors and pharmacists, few people questioned what they were taking. After all, if a professional gave it to you, it had to be safe, right? Here's the irony. Victorians prided themselves on being rational, scientific, and modern. They were obsessed with progress. They measured skulls to study intelligence. They collected fossils to prove evolution. They mapped the world with telegraphs and railroads. But when it came to their own health, they were stuck in a dangerous blend of old beliefs and new chemistry. Now let's pause for a second. Imagine walking into a Victorian pharmacy called an apothecary. Wooden shelves stacked with glass bottles. Labels written in elegant script: laudanum, chlorodyne, vin mariani. The air smells like herbs, alcohol, and chemicals. Behind the counter, a man in a waistcoat carefully measures powders and pours liquids. You ask for something for your headaches. He hands you a small vial filled with a clear solution. He tells you to take a few drops when the pain gets bad. The label says, arsenic solution. Would you take it? Today, you'd probably run. But in Etienne Baba tells you'd swallow it without question, because it came from the trusted hand of a professional. That's the scary part. The problem wasn't that Victorians were careless. It's us that they were trying to be careful, but their knowledge was limited. They didn't know what we know now. They didn't have microscopes that could see viruses. They didn't understand addiction the way we do today. They thought they were using modern science when in reality they were gambling with their health every single day, you know? And here's another twist. Many of these drugs didn't just stay in medicine. They spilled into everyday culture. Cocaine-infused wine was served at dinner parties. Opium syrups were advertised in newspapers right alongside recipes and fashion tips. Arsenic was mixed into beauty products and even used in wallpaper, slowly poisoning families while they admired the color of their walls. Medicine was as separate from daily life. It was baked into it. So here's the big challenge of Victorian medicine. How do you separate a cure from a killer when both come in the same bottle? That was the dilemma every patient faced. They wanted relief. They wanted to trust their doctors, but the science wasn't there yet to keep them safe. This problem shaped the entire Victorian experience. The era looked like progress, but underneath, people were playing chemical roulette. Every sip of tonic, every pill, every powder carried a risk they didn't fully understand. And the strangest part, some of these drugs actually worked, at least temporarily. That's what made them so dangerous. They weren't useless. They really did stop pain, calm nerves, or lift moods. But the price was high. This is why the 7 strange drugs we about to explore matter. They aren't just odd, historical footnotes. They're reminders of a time when medicine was a gamble, when people trusted chemicals that seemed miraculous but often left devastation behind. Stick with me, because in the next section, we're going to start with the most infamous of them all, arsenic, the drug that killed just as often as it cured, and yet somehow became a daily ritual for thousands of people. Arsenic. Just hearing the word probably makes you think of poison bottles with skull and crossbones labels, or maybe an old-fashioned murder mystery where the victim tea was laced with a few drops of the deadly stuff. In fact, arsenic is one of the most notorious poisons in history. And yet, during the Victorian era, people didn't just fear it, they actually loved it. They swallowed it, rubbed it on their skin, and even put it in their beauty products. To them, arsenic wasn't just a deadly poison. It was a miracle drug, a cosmetic, and even a lifestyle. Sounds completely insane, right? But here's the thing. Arsenic in tiny doses doesn't kill instantly. And the Victorians, always chasing new cures and beauty standards, decided to gamble with it. They convinced themselves that small amounts of this lethal substance could make them healthier, stronger, and more attractive. So let's dive deep into this bizarre obsession. Why did Victorians love arsenic? What did they use it for? And how did they manage to survive when their medicine was basically slow motion poison? The arsenic craze begins. To understand the arsenic craze, you have to remember the context. The Victorian era was obsessed with appearances. For women especially, beauty was often measured by how pale your skin looked. Pale skin meant you didn't work outdoors in the sun, which meant you were wealthy, refined, and above manual labor. But keeping that ghostly pale look wasn't easy. Women used face powders, creams, and tonics to lighten their skin, and many of them contained arsenic. That's right, arsenic was marketed as a beauty enhancer. You could buy arsenic wafers or complexion drops, which promised to clear your skin, erase blemishes, and give you that fashionable ivory glow. And here's where things get wild. In a world without antibiotics, without vaccines for many diseases, and without modern painkillers, doctors were desperate. Desperate doctors make risky choices. They reached for anything: powders, syrups, tinctures, and pills that promised relief. If a substance made a patient feel better, even temporarily, it was considered medicine. The big problem? Many of these medicines were actually poisons or highly addictive drugs. Arsenic, opium, cocaine, chloroform, mercury. These weren't just chemicals in a laboratory. They were on store shelves, sitting in family medicine cabinets, and handed out to children. To us, that sounds insane. But to Victorians, it was just part of daily life. Think about how confusing that must have been. Imagine you re a Victorian mother in 1855. Your child has a fever and one tea, stop crying. The doctor hands you a bottle of laudanum, a syrup made from opium, and tells you it will calm the baby. And it works. Your child finally sleeps. You don't know that you've just given your toddler a narcotic that could cause addiction or even death. All you know is the crying stopped. Or picture a factory worker who comes home after a 14-hour shift. His muscles ache, his lungs burn from the coal dust, and he can barely stay awake. He takes a tonic laced with strychnine, a deadly poison in larger doses, but in tiny amounts it makes him feel energized, sharper, almost superhuman. He goes back to work the next day, ready to push through the pain. He doesn't know that each sip is slowly pushing him closer to collapse. The truth is, Victorians were guinea pigs in their own medical experiment. No one fully understood the long-term effects of these drugs. There were no clinical trials, no FDA, no regulations. Companies could market almost anything as a cure as long as it sounded convincing. And people bought it because what choice did they have? When your only options are suffering or trying the latest miracle tonic, of course you pick the tonic. Imagine sitting at your dressing table and each imbibed liquors, carefully swallowing a tiny white wafer of arsenic because you believed it would make your skin look smoother and whiter. You have no idea that it was damaging your organs, messing with your nerves, and shortening your lifespan. All you saw was the short-term result, a pale complexion. And in Victorian society, that result was worth the risk. It wasn't just vanity. Doctors also believed arsenic could be used as a legitimate medicine. In small amounts, arsenic seemed to stimulate the body. Some patients reported feeling more energetic, less anxious, and even happier after taking it. So doctors prescribed it for a whole range of conditions. Got asthma? Take some arsenic. Suffering from malaria? Arsenic pills might help. Women with female troubles? Arsenic solutions were recommended. Even general fatigue or nervous complaints, basically any sign of exhaustion, could be treated with a bit of arsenic. It sounds crazy now, but back then it felt like cutting-edge science. A tiny dose made people feel sharper, more alive. They didn't realize it was also slowly wrecking their bodies. Here's where things get even stranger. People didn't just take arsenic occasionally. Some took it regularly, even daily. And over time, they built up a tolerance. There are reports from places like Styria, a region in Austria, where arsenic eaters became famous. These were farmers and peasants who would chew lumps of arsenic like candy. They believed it made them healthier, stronger, and even more attractive. Supposedly, arsenic eaters had rosy cheeks, boundless energy, and incredible stamina. Some even gave it to their horses to make them look sleek and powerful. Travelers who met these arsenic eaters were stunned. How could people swallow such massive amounts of poison and live? Scientists studied them and realized that regular exposure built tolerance, but it didn't mean they were safe. It just meant their bodies were constantly fighting off poison. Many died young, their organs destroyed by years of arsenic abuse, but their neighbors didn't see the damage. They saw strong men and radiant women, and they wanted the same results. So the fad spread. The real danger was how common arsenic became in everyday products. It wasn't just in medicine and beauty treatments. It was also in things like wallpaper, clothing dyes, and even candy. Yes, you heard that right. Candy. Bright green dyes, known as Scheele S green and Paris green, were made with arsenic. These colors were fashionable in Victorian homes, so people decorated their walls, curtains, and dresses with arsenic-based dyes. The problem? In damp conditions, arsenic wallpaper released toxic fumes. Families were slowly poisoned just by sitting in their beautifully decorated parlors. There are stories of children getting sick from sucking on green-dyed toys, or women fainting at parties because their green ball gowns were literally poisoning them as they danced. And candy makers sometimes used arsenic by mistake when trying to whiten their sugar mixtures. In 80,058, in Bradford, England, more than 20 people died and hundreds were poisoned after eating sweets that had been accidentally laced with arsenic instead of sugar. The scandal rocked the country and showed just how dangerous the casual use of arsenic had become. Why did people keep taking arsenic, even when there were stories of poisoning everywhere? Part of the answer lies in psychology. First, the effects were real. In tiny doses, arsenic gave people a short-term boost. They felt more energetic, looked paler, and believed they were healthier. That immediate result made them ignore the long-term risks. Second, Victorians trusted authority. If a doctor or pharmacist said it was safe, they believed it. There was no Food and Drug Administration, no strict regulations. Medicine was often a mix of science, tradition, and marketing. And arsenic was marketed brilliantly. Third, desperation played a role. Life in the Victorian era was hard. People worked long, hours in dangerous factories, lived in polluted cities, and had few options when they got sick. If arsenic gave them even a little relief, it felt worth the risk. Arsenic didn't just shape everyday health. It also left its mark on culture. Writers, poets, and journalists often mentioned it, sometimes as a metaphor for hidden danger, sometimes as a literal plot device. Arsenic murders became the stuff of legend. Court cases involving arsenic poisoning were widely covered in newspapers, and the drug's double identity. Both medicine and poison fascinated the public. For Plessule or Risfivery. Plestry. One chilling example is the case of Mary Ann Cotton, an Englishwoman suspected of poisoning multiple family members with arsenic in the Echen Babai tirishers. Her story horrified Victorians and cemented arsenicus' reputation as the inheritance powder. But even as people read about arsenic murders, they still swallowed tiny amounts themselves for health and beauty. That contradiction sums up the Victorian mindset perfectly. They feared arsenic, but they couldn't resist it. If arsenic was the poison that people loved, then cocaine was the drug that people practically worshipped. Today, cocaine is illegal almost everywhere. It's infamous, dangerous, and tied to addiction, crime, and ruined lives. But if you time traveled back to the Victorian era, you'd find it being sold openly in pharmacies, endorsed by doctors, and even blessed by the Pope. Yes, the Pope. Cocaine was some underground vice in the 18s. It was considered cutting-edge medicine. It was glamorous, respectable, and for a while, it was hailed as a miracle cure. So how did Victorians go from sipping tea and port wine to sipping cocaine-laced cocktails. And why did some of the smartest people of the era fall head over heels for this powerful drug? Let us dig into it. Cocaine comes from the coca plant, which grows naturally in South America. Indigenous peoples in the Andes had chewed coca leaves for thousands of years to fight fatigue, hunger, and altitude sickness. It gave them energy and helped them survive in harsh conditions. When Europeans discovered coca, they were fascinated. Here was a plant that seemed to supercharge the human body. By the mid-1800s, scientists had figured out how to isolate the pure active ingredient, cocaine. And once they had the pure stuff, they started experimenting like crazy. Doctors, chemists, and entrepreneurs all wanted a piece of it. This was some shady back alley drug. This was modern science, a brand new chemical that seemed to promise endless possibilities. By the 1880s, cocaine was everywhere. Medical journals praised it as a wonder drug. Doctors used it as an anesthetic for eye surgery and dental work because it could numb pain quickly. Patients loved it because it worked fast and made them feel, well, amazing. But it was a tea just for medical procedures. Cocaine was marketed as a cure-all for almost everything. Feeling tired? Cocaine will perk you up. Feeling sad? Cocaine will lift your mood. Heck, have a toothache? Rub a little cocaine solution on your gums. Nervous exhaustion? Try a cocaine tonic. The Victorians even gave it to children. Parents bought cocaine-based toothache drops for their kids. Picture that, a 6-year-old crying in pain, and instead of Tylenol, the parent rubs cocaine into their gums. And it worked. The pain disappeared, the kid calmed down, nobody thought twice about it. The most famous cocaine product of the Victorian age was vin mariani, a French wine infused with coca leaves. Basically, it was red wine plus cocaine, the ultimate Victorian energy drink. It was marketed as a tonic for fatigue, anxiety, and just about everything else. And it became a sensation. Writers, artists, and celebrities swore by it. Even royalty loved it. Pope Leo XIII carried a flask of vin mariani with him, and he even awarded the drink's creator a medal. Imagine that today, the Pope handing out an award to the maker of a cocaine-infused wine. Why was it so popular? Simple, it worked. You'd drink a glass and suddenly feel more awake, more confident, more alive. The combination of alcohol and cocaine gave people a euphoric buzz. And because it was sold in fancy bottles and endorsed by famous people, it seemed sophisticated, not dangerous. One of the biggest fans of cocaine was none other than Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. In the Faust and 880s, Freud was fascinated by the drug. He experimented with it on himself and recommended it to his friends and patients. He believed cocaine could treat depression, anxiety, and even morphine addiction. He called it a magical substance and wrote glowing articles about its benefits. Freud was so enthusiastic that he sometimes blamed for helping spread cocaine's popularity across Europe. Of course, he later regretted it. Some of the people he gave cocaine to became addicted or suffered terrible health effects, but by then the hype was unstoppable. Cocaine had already taken on a life of its own. Cocaine in everyday products. Here is where it gets even crazier. Cocaine did not just stay in medicine and tonics. It started showing up in everyday consumer products. Soothing syrups, tooth powders, lozenges, all laced with cocaine. Some products even combined cocaine with other dangerous drugs like opium and sold them as all-in-one cures. It got to the point where Victorian households might have multiple cocaine-based products in their cabinets right alongside soap and flour. You didn't have to be rich to use it either. Cocaine was surprisingly affordable, and it was sold everywhere. Even in America, cocaine started popping up in products. The original formula of Coca-Cola, invented in the 1880s, contained coca leaf extract. That's where the name comes from, Wiccank. Coca for the coca plant and cola for the cola nut. So yes, early Coca-Cola actually contained cocaine. It was a tea removed until the early century, but in the Victorian age, that was just normal. Why people loved it? So why did people love cocaine so much? Part of the answer is simple. It made them feel incredible. Cocaine increases dopamine in the brain, giving you a rush of pleasure, confidence, and energy. Victorians didn't understand the brain chemistry, but they knew how it made them feel. And compared to the dull, exhausting grind of Victorian life, that boost felt miraculous. Think about it. If you were a factory worker pulling 12-hour shifts, a doctor drowning in patients, or a mother dealing with constant stress, a glass of Vin Mariani or a spoonful of cocaine tonic could make everything feel manageable. For a moment, life was brighter. And unlike alcohol, which left you sluggish the next day, cocaine made you feel sharp and alert. That was part of its appeal. It wasn't just about escaping reality, it was about powering through it. Of course, there was a dark side. The Victorians didn't yet understand addiction the way we do today. They thought if something was sold in pharmacies and endorsed by doctors, it must be safe. But cocaine wasn't safe. Regular use led to dependence. People needed more and more to get the same effect. And as the doses went up, so did the side effects. Paranoia, heart problems, nose damage, insomnia, and eventually total collapse. Doctors began noticing patients who seemed to fall apart after long-term cocaine use. The very drug that was supposed to energize them ended up destroying their health. Some even experienced what we now call cocaine psychosis, with hallucinations, wild mood swings, and paranoia. But because addiction was as well understood, many Victorians blamed the patients themselves, not the drug. It's also interesting to look at how cocaine was tied to class. In some ways, it was a drug of the elite. Writers, artists, and professionals loved it. It was glamorous, intellectual, and fashionable. Drinking Vin Mariani or carrying a cocaine tonic was like a status symbol. But at the same time, it was accessible to ordinary people. You didn't have to be rich to buy a small bottle of cocaine drops so it blurred class lines. It was the rare drug that could be found in the pocket of a factory worker and on the desk of a famous poet. That broad appeal helped it spread quickly until it seemed like everyone was using it for something. By the late 19th century, the backlash began. Reports of addiction and death piled up. Some doctors started warning against cocaine. Newspapers published shocking stories of people ruined by the drug. The shine wore off, and people began to see the dangers. By the early 20th century, governments started regulating and restricting cocaine. Coca-Cola quietly changed its formula. Vin Mariani faded away, and cocaine's reputation flipped from miracle cure to dangerous vice. Cocaine's story in the Victorian era is a perfect example of how societies fall in love with new drugs. At first, it feels like a miracle. People focus on the benefits, ignore the risks, and celebrate the results. But slowly, the dark side reveals itself. Addiction spreads, health declines, and the same drug that was hailed as a savior becomes a villain. That cycle has repeated over and over in history, not just with cocaine, but with opioids, amphetamines, and even modern prescription drugs. The Victorian cocaine craze is just one chapter in a much bigger story about human hope, desperation, and the search for relief. And here's the thing, cocaine wasn't even the most common Victorian drug. That honor goes to opium, especially in the form of laudanum. If cocaine was the glamorous party guest of the Victorian age, opium was the quiet companion hiding in almost every household. It was cheap, addictive, and everywhere. Writers used it, mothers gave it to their babies, and entire communities floated through life in an opium haze. And that BS exactly what we were going to dive into next. If arsenic was the poison people loved and cocaine was the glamorous miracle drug, then opium was the quiet giant of the Victorian age. It wasn't flashy like cocaine or scandalous like arsenic. It was everywhere, woven into daily life in ways that are hard to imagine now. Opium was the Victorian sleeping pill, the painkiller, the antidepressant, the cough syrup, quinine, and in many ways, the comfort blanket of the surreal century. It crossed class lines, seeping into the lives of the rich and poor alike. And while other drugs came and went, opium stuck around, leaving a deeper mark on Victorian society than almost anything else. When people talk about Victorian opium, one word always comes up: laudanum. Laudanum was liquid opium, usually mixed with alcohol, and it was the go-to drug of the era. It was cheap, widely available, and ridiculously versatile. You could buy it at your local apothecary, no questions asked. You didn't need a prescription. It was advertised in newspapers and sold in bottles that looked almost harmless. People used laudanum for headaches, stomach pains, menstrual cramps, coughs, insomnia, depression, diarrhea, anxiety, basically anything you could think of. Parents even gave it to their children to help them sleep. And it worked. That is what made laudanum so powerful. It dulled pain. It calmed nerves. It gave people an escape from the endless stresses of Victorian life. In a world without antibiotics, without modern surgery, and without reliable medicine, laudanum seemed like a miracle. One of the most fascinating things about opium in Victorian times is how universal it was. Unlike some drugs that were associated with a particular class, opium cut across society. Once the working class used it to get through brutal factory shifts or to numb the constant aches of manual labor. It was cheaper than a doctor's visit and easier to find. Drowsiness mothers gave it to their babies to stop them from crying. Godfrey S. Cordial and Mother S. Friend were infamous baby-soothing syrups made with opium. Imagine that, you re-exhausted from work, your child one teat stops screaming, and the local apothecary sells you a sweet syrup that guarantees peace and quiet. Of course, the baby isn't just calm. They redrugged. Many infants died this way, but desperate, mothers felt like they had no choice. Dostin. The middle class turned to opium as a cure for nerves and sleepless nights. Respectable families might keep a bottle of laudanum in the cupboard, right next to the brandy and tea. The upper class and artists were perhaps the most famous users. Writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas de Quincey, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and even Charles Dickens all had relationships with laudanum. For them, opium was both a muse and a curse. Opium didn't belong to one group. It belonged to everyone. It was as common as aspirin is. Today, one of the most famous stories of Victorian opium use is Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821. This book shocked readers because it openly described both the pleasures and the horrors of addiction. De Quincey admitted he first took opium for pain relief, but soon he began using it for the sheer bliss it brought. He wrote about walking through London, intoxicated by visions of beauty and wonder under the influence of opium. At first, it seemed like heaven, but then came the nightmares, the cravings, the terrifying dreams, the despair of dependence. De Quincey's confessions revealed what many Victorians suspected, that this harmless medicine could become a chain. His book became famous not just because it was shocking, but because it captured the double life of opium. On the one hand, it offered relief, inspiration, and comfort. On the other, it devoured lives from the inside out. It's worth noting that many of the heaviest opium users in Victorian society were women. This was a team because women loved drugs more. It was because of the conditions they faced. Victorian women were often diagnosed with vague illnesses like hysteria, nervous, exhaustion, or female troubles. Doctors had few real treatments to offer, so they prescribed laudanum. It became the standard remedy for almost anything a woman might complain about. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the famous poet, was one of many women who relied on laudanum for years. She suffered from chronic illness and pain, and opium was the only thing that gave her relief. Her poetry was written under its influence, a testament to both its inspiration and its grip. For countless women, laudanum was both a medical tool and a trap. It allowed them to function in a restrictive society, but it also locked them into cycles of dependency. Opium wasn't just a domestic drug, it was also a global commodity tied deeply to the British Empire. Britain imported vast amounts of opium from India, where it was cultivated under the control of the East India Company. And they didn't just keep it for themselves. They sold it aggressively to China, sparking the infamous Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. While Victorian families sipped laudanum at home, Chinese families were being torn apart by mass addiction. Britain fought wars to keep the opium trade alive, all while pretending at home that it was just another harmless medicine. This contradiction is one of the most troubling aspects of Victorian history. In Britain, opium was sold in elegant bottles and even given to soothe restless children, while at the same time it drove a vast international trade that reshaped entire nations. Although widely accepted, not everyone considered opium harmless. Physicians observed patients who seemed unable to function without it, and families quietly worried about loved ones whose health declined under its influence. The modern term addiction did not yet exist. Instead, people spoke of being enslaved to the drug or of having a habit. Many Victorians believed the fault lay in personal weakness rather than in the substance itself. This stigma made recovery difficult, forcing many to conceal their dependence. Writers such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge produced lasting works of art while privately battling opium use. Meanwhile, respectable households might condemn the so-called opium fiend in poorer districts, even as they discreetly relied on laudanum themselves. To grasp just how common opium was, imagine daily life in Victorian London. A factory worker takes laudanum before beginning a long shift. A middle-class woman sips a dose at night to help her sleep. A mother soothes her child with Godfrey's cordial. A writer keeps a bottle close at hand for inspiration. Even a physician, after a demanding day of treating patients, might use it for his own relief. Far from being unusual or illicit, opium was woven into ordinary routines. Nearly every household kept a supply. Yet this familiarity carried a cost. Long-term use often led to health problems such as digestive issues, dizziness, memory loss, and emotional instability. Some individuals became physically weakened, while others suffered depression when they tried to stop. Infants, given opium-based medicines, sometimes grew ill or failed to thrive. Among working-class families, reliance on laudanum could contribute to financial and personal hardship. Because opium use was so widespread, these consequences often faded into the background of Victorian life. To really understand how common opium was, imagine a day in Victorian London. A factory worker wakes up with aching muscles. He takes a spoonful of laudanum before heading to work. A middle-class woman can't sleep at night, so she sips her laudanum mixture before bed. A mother soothes her fussy baby with Godfrey's cordial. A writer sits at his desk, chasing inspiration, a bottle of laudanum within reach. Even the local doctor, after treating patients all day, might use laudanum himself for stress and exhaustion. Opium was a TT exotic. It was a TT taboo. It was normal. Everyone knew someone who used it. Everyone had a bottle in the cupboard. That's what made it so powerful. It wasn't a fringe drug. It was part of the fabric of life. The side effects, of course, there was a price. Long-term opium use took a heavy toll. Constipation, memory loss, dizziness, mood swings, and dependence were common. Some users wasted away, physically, unable to eat properly. Others fell into deep depression when they tried to quit. Babies given opium often became sickly or died young. Working-class families that relied on laudanum sometimes collapsed under the weight of addiction. But because opium was everywhere, these tragedies often blended into the background of Victorian life. The cultural shadow, opium didn't just shape individual lives, it shaped culture. It was in the novels, the poetry, the newspapers. Charles Dickens wrote about opium dens in London, where addicts from all walks of life gathered in smoky, dimly lit rooms. For many Victorians, opium was a symbol of both escape and decay. It represented the contradictions of the age, progress on the surface, but quiet suffering underneath. It also fed the Gothic imagination. The hazy, dreamlike visions induced by laudanum influenced art and literature. Some of the most haunting works of the era carry the fingerprints of opium's influence. The beginning of change. By the late 14th century, the tide began to turn. Medical professionals started warning about the dangers of opium. Campaigners pushed for regulation. Newspapers published stories about infant deaths linked to soothing syrups. Gradually, laws were introduced to restrict its sale. By the early 18th century, laudanum was no longer the casual household remedy it had once been. But the legacy of opium lingered. Entire generations had lived and died under its influence. Why opium mattered most. So why does opium stand out among all the Victorian drugs? because it was the most widespread, the most accepted, and arguably the most destructive. Arsenic and cocaine had their moments, but opium was constant. It touched every class, every family, every corner of Victorian society. It offered comfort in a brutal world, but at the cost of dependence and decline. It inspired art, fueled empire, and shaped culture. And it showed just how thin the line between medicine and addiction can be. Teaser for next section: if you think laudanum was strange, wait until we get to the Victorians' experiments with chloroform. Imagine a drug that could knock you out cold in seconds, used not just in hospitals, but sometimes in drawing rooms, parlors, and even parties. The dangers were real, but the fascination was unstoppable. That is where we heading next. If opium was the Victorian sleeping pill, then chloroform was the Victorian knockout punch. It was the drug that could silence screams, numb unbearable pain, and change the very nature of surgery. But it was also a drug that terrified people, because while it could save your life, it could also end it in seconds. Chloroform was one of the most revolutionary and controversial substances of the Victorian era. It offered something people had dreamed about for centuries: painless surgery. Imagine going through an amputation, a tooth extraction, or childbirth without the agony. For Victorians, this seemed like magic. But behind the magic was a very real danger. Chloroform didn't he always play nice? Sometimes it killed. To understand why chloroform was so appealing, let us picture surgery before anesthesia. Imagine it's 1835. You have injured your leg, and the only option is amputation. You relayed on a wooden table in a cold, candlelit room. There are no sterile gloves, no antibiotics, no modern machines beeping in the background. Just a surgeon with a saw and a team of assistants whose job is to hold you down. You reawake for the entire thing. You feel every slice, every movement of the saw, every tug on your flesh. The surgeon works quickly, not out of mercy, but because speed is the only way to reduce the suffering. A good amputation might take less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes of pure horror. This was surgery before anesthesia, brutal, traumatic, and often fatal, not just from infection, but from the shock and blood loss of the ordeal. So when chloroform came along, it felt like a miracle. For the first time in history, people could be put to sleep during surgery. They wouldn't feel the knife. They wouldn't have to be tied down. It was the dawn of modern medicine. Chloroform was first synthesized in the 1830s, but its medical use really took off in the 1840s and 1850s. The Scottish physician James Young Simpson was one of its biggest champions. Simpson began experimenting with chemicals to find a better anesthetic than ether, which was already being used but had drawbacks like causing irritation and nausea. In 1847, he and 2 colleagues tried inhaling chloroform in his dining room. They all passed out cold on the floor. When they woke up, Simpson realized he had found something powerful. He started using chloroform for childbirth and surgery, and his success stories spread quickly. Newspapers reported on the miracle drug. Suddenly, what had once been unimaginable, painless childbirth, painless amputations, seemed possible.
When we think of Victorian drugs, we usually imagine exotic poisons, dangerous tonics, or strange powders. sold in apothecaries. But the truth is, the most widely used drug of all was hiding in plain sight. It was as tea arsenic. It was a tea cocaine. It was a tea even opium. It was something far more ordinary, alcohol. Yes, plain old alcohol, beer, gin, wine, brandy. But in the Victorian era, alcohol wasn't tea just for pubs or parties. It was also sold as medicine. Doctors prescribed it, mothers gave it to their children, and apothecaries bottled it up as nervous tonics and stomach bitters. Alcohol was the drug that didn't even look like a drug. It was respectable, familiar, and everywhere. And that's exactly what made it so powerful and so dangerous. Victorian doctors prescribed alcohol for an astonishing range of conditions. It was believed, too, does stimulate the appetite. Does aid digestion. Does calm nervous disorders. Does treat insomnia. Does fight fevers. Does ease pain. Does revive patients near death. Brandy was especially popular as a cure. A sick child, give them brandy. A woman in childbirth, brandy. A patient recovering from surgery, brandy again. Alcohol was seen as both food and drug. It provided calories, warmth, and a quick jolt of energy. For doctors who had few other treatments available, it was an easy recommendation. The Victorian era was also the golden age of tonics and bitters. These were bottled concoctions, often made with herbs, sugar, and a hefty dose of alcohol. Bitters were marketed as digestive aids. A few drops before or after a meal were supposed to cure indigestion, heartburn, and sluggishness. In reality, many bitters were bifidobacter, alcohol, or higher. Drinking them was basically like taking a shot of strong liquor, but because it was called medicine, it seemed respectable. Other tonics promised to cure nervous exhaustion, a vague but popular Victorian diagnosis. These bottles were advertised as a way to calm the nerves, boost energy, and restore health. The secret ingredient, of course, was alcohol. It was a tea unusual for respectable households to keep bottles of these tonics in the cupboard and sip them daily, convinced they were improving their health. One of the most shocking aspects of Victorian alcohol use was how often it was given to children. Brandy was a common treatment for coughs, colds, and fevers in children. Parents gave their kids spoonfuls of alcohol as casually as we might give a child paracetamol or cough syrup today. Some tonics marketed specifically for children contained alcohol too. Soothing syrups that promised to calm fussy babies were often loaded with both alcohol and opiates. Parents, though desperate for relief, didn't realize they were dosing their children with addictive substances. For poor families, alcohol was sometimes the cheapest and easiest way to quiet a child. Numb their hunger or help them sleep. It's hard to imagine now, but in the 14th century, it was considered normal. For the working class, alcohol wasn't just medicine, it was survival. Factory workers drank beer and gin to get through exhausting shifts. Alcohol dulled pain, gave quick energy, and provided comfort after long hours of labor. Cheap gin was sometimes seen as the poor man's doctor. If you couldn't afford to see a physician, a swig of gin might feel like the next best thing. It numbed toothaches, soothed nerves, and kept the cold at bay. Of course, it also fueled addiction, violence, and poverty. The Victorian period inherited the legacy of the earlier gin craze of the 14th century, when cheap gin ravaged London's poor. By the 14th century, reformers were still battling the fallout, but alcohol remained deeply entrenched in working-class culture. Now, to really see how common alcohol as medicine was, imagine a day in Victorian London. A middle-class woman takes a dose of nervous tonic to calm her anxiety. She tells herself it's medicine, but really she'd drinking what amounts to a small glass of whiskey. Dunena factory worker comes home exhausted. His wife gives the children a spoonful of brandy for their coughs, then pours herself a sherry to ease her nerves. The Dugan, a wealthy gentleman, hosts a dinner party. He serves port and claret as part of the meal, then ends the evening with fine brandy, insisting it aids. Dugan, a doctor, visits a patient with fever. He prescribes wine for strength, perhaps the only treatment he has to offer. This was as unusual. It was normal life. Alcohol was everywhere, and its role as medicine blurred the line between treatment and indulgence. Of course, the dangers were immense. Alcohol addiction tore through Victorian society, though it was often hidden behind the label of medicine. Children given brandy developed tolerance at a young age. Adults who relied on tonics often slipped into dependency. So families wasted money on bottles of bitters that did little except keep them buzzed. And because alcohol was so normalized, the damage was often overlooked. Addiction wasn't seen as a medical problem, but as a moral failing. People blamed the drunkard, not the drug. So why does alcohol deserve a place alongside arsenic, opium, cocaine, chloroform, and mercury in the list of strange Victorian drugs? Because it shows us how blurred the line between medicine and recreation really was. Victorians didn't think of alcohol as a drug in the way we do now. They thought of it as food, medicine, comfort, and tradition. And yet it shaped lives, destroyed families, and fueled debates that continue to this day. Alcohol was the drug hiding in plain sight. It soothed babies, calmed nerves, fueled workers, and entertained the wealthy. It was everywhere, respectable and dangerous at the same time. And in the end, it may have been the most Victorian drug of all. Ordinary, accepted, and quietly destructive. But alcohol was at the end of the Victorian drug cabinet. There was one more strange category of substances that fascinated the Victorians, the so-called patent medicines. Bottled cures sold with bold promises and mysterious ingredients. These were the snake oils of the age, often laced with alcohol, opium, or other hidden drugs. And they reveal just how far people would go for hope in a bottle.